Thank you again. And with that, I'd like to welcome Agence from Paris and somebody's from Germany hiding out, and all the other team members. We'll let Olivier introduce his team. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So my name is Cezanne Charles, and I am really delighted to introduce our multidisciplinary design team. So we're going to kick things off with our locally based design teams, but before I really get started, I want you to know that we all work very hard in order to produce contextually and culturally and environmentally specific places that really are about affordances and convergences. And within our team, we cover disciplines that include architecture and urban design and policy and technology and sustainability, as well as the creative industries. So we're really pleased to sort of give you our credentials today and invite you into our kind of vision for how we see the DIA Plaza and the MCC cultural connections. So with that, our locally based teams start with a co-key, which is Anya Sirota and Jean-Louis Farge. They principally work in the North End and internationally, connecting culture and context in order to produce aesthetically relevant solutions at the urban scale. They're really known for the way that this produces creative innovation, right? And then finally, Cezanne Charles with Root of Two. We're a hybrid design studio that I co-direct along with John Marshall. And we really create projects that investigate the way that both technology is really disrupting and changing and mitigating the way we think about the city scale. So we produce social objects, experiences, and works in the public realm, and we engage participants in what we think of as civic future making. We also have Harley Earl, a noted author, researcher, and consultant, as well as teacher, who really applies the ideas around how social, cultural, and political context, coupled with public institutions, really facilitate deep and lasting urban neighborhood change. And then we move to some of our international members. So we have TransSolar, who are world leaders in terms of combating climate change, and they do this through a process of continuous innovation within the built environment. One of the things that they really are known for is the way that they think about how sustainability has to have lasting outcomes and impacts now and into the future. And then, of course, we have Agence and Olivier Philippe. And I'm really pleased that we are all working together on this team in order to really facilitate something that they're really noted for, which is bridging the worlds of architecture, design, and urbanism. And especially in the way that they embrace local conditions of site and place in order to facilitate the way that landscape can actually change and transform the metropolitan scale. So that's like a really quick introduction into our team. And over the course of the presentation, we're going to tell you a little bit more about ourselves and show you a little bit more about ourselves. But before I hand it over to my colleague, Harley, I just also want to make sure that I thank the DIA and MDI, as well as the member institutions of the MCC, the members of the jury, the steering committee, all of the stakeholders and funders that have come together to offer this opportunity to our community. And first and foremost, I also want to thank the people of Detroit. This is an exceptional opportunity, and we're really privileged to be up here today.
Thank you, Cezanne. For our presentation, we thought that it was very important to make sure the jurors and the audience understood how much we know about Detroit and about the context of the DIA and the Midtown Cultural Connections area. We have to go back to the history of Edward Bennett's 1915 plan for the city of Detroit, which included a proposal for a arts district here in the center of the city, which was then the center of the city. And the proposal, thank you, Maurice. So the proposal there really wasn't, the first two anchors were the public library across the street and the DIA, 1921 and 1927 respectively, and then other institutions followed and grew into the site. Some were intentionally placed here, like the College of Creative Studies, and then Wayne State grew from a small teachers college into Wayne State University, and then other institutions joined later, specifically the Charles Wright Museum coming into their second building on the site in 1998, and the Michigan Science Center in 2012, taking over for the Detroit Science Center, which closed in 2011. So over time, there have been several attempts to create an intentional campus for the Arts District. And the most notable ones are the one from 1951, the city plan, which called for the expansion of the DIA and the public library, but was never implemented. And then we have this is an image from the 1965 plan. The city planning office actually created this at the behest of Mayor Jerome Kavanaugh. And that plan was very controversial in that it would have displaced 2,900 African American households. And so at that time, there was an opposition plan that was created by the Arts District's Community Development Corporation in response, and that plan was actually presented to the Detroit Planning Commission and adopted in 1971. So a part of what we want to make sure that we're very clear about here is that we see these different institutions that actually operate together and then in some ways on their own. I want to offer this quote from a famous urbanist: "The city fosters art and is art. The city creates theater and is the theater. The city as theater demands more purposes, activities, are focused and work out through conflicting and cooperating personalities, events, groups, and into more significant culminations." And so you can see from the images that we have here that we're presenting some images of what we think the networks actually look like. Of course, this is not a very scientific view of this, but one thing that's very important for actually looking at these institutions and seeing them as a constellation of organizations in that they all receive some significant public support in some way. And that actually makes them very unique in that this could be, is and can be the nerve center of the region's arts and cultural center. And so we have these maps that show you kind of what the regional context for this is that truly is at the center. But there also are these global connections that actually make this more accessible and interesting to people, not just in the Detroit region, but all over the world. And we see a key theme of our presentation being social convergence, and that this being a zone where people can actually gather, come together, debate, learn, and actually engage in discourse around these ideas. I'm going to pass it on to Anya.
Thank you, Etienne. Yes, my name is Anya Sirota. Thanks for the introduction, Cezanne, to all of our work. My partner and I, Jean-Louis, and a broad network of cultural actors, designers, residents, landscape architects have been working together for the last few years, looking at ways that we can systematize and understand what causes social convergence, what creates environments that are inclusive, that are equitable, that are inviting. Some of our projects have looked at questions of iconicity. How can designers and architects imagine symbols and signifiers that get people to the table, that get people to feel comfortable, confident in expressing their cultural values, their heritage, and their backgrounds? We've worked with communities like the Oakland Avenue Urban Farm, developing a 6-acre urban commons, looking at the ways that collectively everyone can have a sense of ownership about the way that their community and their neighborhood develops. And we've looked at ways that culture, cultural production, cultural activity can be at the forefront of community engagement efforts. There's so much cultural activity happening in neighborhoods, and how can we understand that as the instigator and the driver for what our values and our assets are in the city? So sometimes we question, when we're working on large-scale urban projects, how can we invite community into a cultural project? And in many cases, that creates a kind of dichotomy, a binary opposition between culture and community. And in the way that we've been thinking about this as a team, community is culture and culture is community. It's our greatest asset in Detroit, and dividing those two definitions might not be as useful as figuring them as a collective. And so we've looked at some of the efforts that have been sustained through foundations in Detroit that create these kind of micro-urban utopias or cultural projects at the small neighborhood urban scale. And there are so many, and there's so much activity happening in neighborhoods. And we are starting to imagine as a collective how that activity can diffuse and enter the conversation about what the cultural commons might look like at the DIA, and how the DIA's efforts might be disseminated and dispersed broadly into those neighborhoods. So if there are barriers to creating this kind of commons or common ground, then we're thinking of those issues not so much as barriers, but as opportunities and affordances. And if, for example, the climate in our region is kind of tough, then we're looking for ways to engage that climate 365 days of the year. For example, our partners who weren't able to make it here from Germany have worked recently on projects, for example, in Moscow, looking at how to make comfort zones, microclimates in the urban realm. They've looked at how to create cooling areas in Place de la République. This is Transsolar's project for a kind of civic commons at the heart of the Parisian landscape. And when we think about mobility, it's not so much about solving the problem of a great infrastructure through a cultural project like the DIA and the cultural district, but it's about thinking about opportunities for dispersal. How, for example, as in the work of Patrick Bouchin, who has created a mobile museum that travels outside of the perimeters of Paris and outside of the Centre Pompidou and engages communities and neighborhoods that might not have access to that kind of cultural activity. How can we imagine systems that are reciprocal between what happens in community and what happens at the urban core? And then in terms of questions of equity and access, I have to make reference to someone in the audience here, Jerry Hebron, who's here from the Oakland Avenue Urban Farm. And one thing that I learned from working with Jerry is she said that the most important thing for community is not to just feel welcome or invited, is to have a sense of belonging. How can architecture, landscape architecture, and urbanism create a sense of belonging where everyone feels like they're represented, not just invited to the table? And so I feel like all of the members of this team have worked in profound ways to create that sense of belonging among their partners, stakeholders, and the community members that they touch. This is a project from Agence Terre. This is the Parc des Docks that was completed that engages a neighborhood in its periphery and the inhabitants in creating a civic park. The work of Root of Two, and this is a kind of gadget that an urban comfort object, that's better stated, that they designed outside of the Rackham building that was part of the de-electricity. And in our own practice, this is a project that we curated with a co-aki called Crop It Up. So looking at ways to engage local cultural activity as we talk about broader issues of urbanism and development. And so a great question for us are issues revolving around iconicity, imageability, and legibility of the urban landscape and how it relates to the cultural heritage of place and the collective imaginary. I'll leave it there, and I'll pass it over to Olivier Philippe, who can unpack it a little bit further.
Thank you, Anya. Up, like this. Good afternoon, I'm Olivier Philippe, one of the three principals of Agence Terre, the landscape architecture and urbanism office, mainly located in Paris. Harley spoke a lot about the urban history of Detroit, so I won't add any comments, although I'm not sure to have the knowledge. I just want to share a few thoughts that we have about the place and how should we intend to proceed to respond. Does it work like this? To this issue. So the first thing is very abstract, I'm sorry, is the idea of the common ground. So the idea of the common ground is not only concerning the outdoor spaces, it's also concerning the buildings, what's in the building. One single shared place. So it's very abstract, so it's more an interrogation than an answer, but it's something we want to work on. Probably this means about the outdoor spaces that we will have to get rid of the existing car park. We have to simplify the place. I mean, we have to solve things differently. Today it's totally fragmented, divided, and I could say, even though it's a caricature, each institution has its own car park and its own piece of street to have an access, a direct access to its institution. So this is probably something that has to be changed. We don't know to what extent, but probably this is the main one of the big questions. I think it was one of the questions, should we close streets? Probably. Not, maybe not all, we don't know how, but probably. The district, the cultural district is in the middle of the town, more or less, in the middle of Detroit, but the DIA is in the middle of the middle. So, so it's also, when you look at the different entrances, they are not, I don't know, you say that in English, we say they are not talking each together, no? So it's a big problem to, if you want to create a common ground, it's a big problem. So the DIA today blocks, in a way, the good connectivity in all directions. So this is something probably we have to think about. We have to think about this. We don't know how. Now we have this option. We have this one too. We have others, more simple, maybe more less, dangerous for us. So the first, when we work on projects, and the first is what is the source code? What do we call the source code? I don't know, maybe we call it the genius of the place. It's more than the genius of the place. What possibilities offer the place? No? So we were talking about the ground. Everybody, it's very visible. So it's obvious that it's divided by streets and by car parks and whatever. But it seems that you have other possibilities. It's like layers, 3 layers. No, one possibility is what's happening underground. We're underground here. No, not really. Half. Yeah. It seems that we don't have the knowledge of the existing underground spaces, but it seems that you have a certain number of underground spaces in many institutions, plus this car park which is unused, and probably in the future, if we need more space on the surface, we need to solve in a different way, maybe underground, the car park, with a new car park. So suddenly this is a possibility. We don't know what is the real value of this possibility, but we think that we have to explore this because it's a very specific situation to be underground. So the ground, and then the last possibility is the rooftop, because it's, and we like to go where, places where nobody goes, nobody. So nobody goes on rooftop. I think it's totally inaccessible today. I don't know. We have a very, very little knowledge of this too. But we think that this, due to the fact that Detroit is a flat city except this high-rise building, it's an incredible situation to be on the rooftop. So maybe it will work a few months, a year, due to Detroit climate. But it's something we did in Paris, in Palais de Tokyo, having a small thing. So you could rent a room on the, or you could have a restaurant also on the rooftop, small restaurant. So, well, for us, this is the 3 layers offers possibilities, and 2 of them are today totally unknown. So, an diffusion, Anya spoke about this, so it's the idea of the hub. Finally, the cultural district is a kind of a hub, should be a kind of hub. Diffusing, infusing. I just wanted to show, this is not our project, it's La Villette Park in Paris, but I work on this project. It has strong similarities in terms of size, because it's a bit bigger than the site, but comparable. It has been designed by an American, but it's finally the idea was to have a single surface, plane. You say plane? Yeah, plane surface, connected to the city completely. It's easy to walk from the city streets to you cross the park. No, it's totally open, which in France was completely new. And it's full of public facilities at big scale. You have the Philharmonie, designed by Jean Nouvel. You have the National Science Museum. You have other museums. You have a lot of things, and you have at the same time you have everyday users that includes kids are playing soccer because it's located on northeast of Paris. So it's the surroundings are the poorest part of Paris, and so there's a lot of users, different types, crossing the different social classes, and it's very successful. I work on this. I was in charge of the flatness, and they used to call me Mr. Flat. See that.
So one of the things that becomes really important as we began to consider our proposal and our work was the way that we are all also tethered by this idea of really wanting to make social impact that was just, vital, and inclusive. And so for us, this really looks like understanding precedent, right? So whether it's the 2 reports that I've been fortunate enough to work on through my role at Creative Mini, looking at the creative industries and the way that they're a driver of economic success in Detroit. So like within the Detroit region, it's about $2 billion in wages, to thinking about the nonprofit arts and cultural work that happens through the Cultural Data Project, which again shows the way that both activities and other things are driving cultural tourism in our city, to also thinking about the city's own open data as a real source for understanding precedent that's important for shaping our vision for the project going forward, as well as looking at kind of national work that's really leading practice around how you actually create the inclusive city, which was done through the Urban Institute as well as through partners at the Kresge Foundation in terms of looking at civic inclusion as a real benchmark. And Detroit is one of the cities that comes 96 within that profile. So really seeing how precedent can really shape the way that we think about design, but then finally also thinking about what are those signals that we need to be designing for? What's our theory of change around that? So how are we going to measure that and come at that? And again, looking at the way that the NEA already has arts and livability indicators, as well as sort of looking at more new and novel approaches through reimagining civic commons, as well as importantly, and I also serve on the stewardship board for the UNESCO City of Design in Detroit, how does it fit into its action plan? How does it fit into that 10-year horizon, which is really looking at how inclusive design is driving growth in the city? So for us, we really kind of wanted to think about what impact meant when we took all of those things together. And it's really this idea that what we're creating should be both creative, sustainable, social, resilient, economic, and technological impacts driven through arts and culture within the MCC. And the way that we think about this is it's really about creating inclusive impacts that, again, through this infusion and diffusion, radiates out throughout the rest of the city. And the way that we think about this is being able to look at both qualitative and quantitative measures that show the impact of the district over time in a longitudinal way. So really thinking about like what is the researchable question at the core of creating distinctive and beautiful and inviting places that really create belonging. And so I'm going to hand it back over to Olivier.
Yes, so thank you. I just want to show 2 or 3 projects that has strong similarities to Detroit, to this competition. The first is Barcelona. Barcelona, the project of Canopia. It's located in the center. What is it? Do you have this? In the middle. So it's there. Now. It's in the middle of the main axis of Barcelona, the Barcelona design, thank you, by Ildefonso Cerda in the middle of the 19th century, and it was supposed to be the new Barcelona at the turn of the 20th century. It took much more time, and it has been. It was designed as a new center of Barcelona. But finally, it always has been an interchange during more than 100 years. An interchange. The last interchange was built in the 90s, nicely designed by an architect, with a park in the middle, never worked. And this has been destroyed. And then the competition has been held, and we won. We won with 3 main principles. The first one is probably the same issue in Detroit, the idea of the continuous ground. the common ground, dedicated to the people, pedestrians, bikers, etc., instead of the cars. The second idea was a lot about giving a response to the climatic change and providing comfort into the city. Barcelona is nice, has nice public spaces, very well designed. There's some trees, but the ground is totally concrete, or I don't know, said asphalt. And it's a strong, the fact that it's not permeable is a strong issue regarding the climate change. So the idea was to provide a tree canopy and a very permeable ground in order to emphasize the idea of diversity in the center of Barcelona, and also to create this cooling, natural cooling system. So we, like France Solar, we're working on this kind of issues. And the third idea was to have this kind of nodes, this kind of places, more or less round, that connects vertically the canopy and the ground. For biodiversity reasons, it's enclosed space, nobody enters in, so it's diameter of more than 40 meters, it's closed. It's not accessible to human. And other nodes are programmatic nodes. So finally, these kind of issues are also the issues we have here, probably in different ways, but it's the same issues. So I have a small, doesn't work? Yeah. So you don't have the sound, I'm sorry. You will not hear the birds and things like that, but it's the cross-section that and it's, I don't know, we have a problem with the computer, but you can see that how it cools with a mist system that provide more cool wet climate, and then how this micronodes collect the water, the rainwater, and how it's a protected area, how you cross the main axis of Barcelona, the Avinguda Diagonal, and finally you climb above the canopy. This is the axis. You see La Sagrada Familia on the background, and so I'm sorry, it's a and you climb above, and you can have an overview of 360 degrees over Barcelona. So we shortened the film because it's more long, but it's the same. The idea of the common ground, the idea of the layers. So it's in a different way, but it's the same idea. The second is Pershing Square in Los Angeles. So Barcelona, the first phase of Barcelona will be completed in March 2019. So it's about 1/3 of it's big. It's about 15 hectares. Second project is Pershing Square in Los Angeles. We won this competition 2 years ago, and it's much more small, but you know probably that Los Angeles don't have many public spaces, especially in downtown. So it's one of the most important public spaces in the downtown. And today it's completely divided by a lot of obstacles. So it's not an issue of design. I don't say that the obstacles are badly designed. I just say it's obstacles. And the users, the flexibility of the users is impossible. It's very difficult to use the space. So our first idea is to give it back to the people, and give it back to the people is make it flat. It's not necessarily flat to give it back to the people, but in this case it's flat. To destroy, to erase all the obstacle, and to offer a very simple surface with also a tree canopy, and with also a pergola, huge pergola that provide shelter during summer, and some different small facilities. And then it's all about programming. You know, you can make your own program, like in La Villette. You can lay down and benefit from the sun. You can have picnic, whatever, and you can listen to music, and it could be programmed also with big events. It's already like this, no? This is the idea of the common ground, is that the flexibility. So it's not about design. I mean, we have to design it anyway, and it has to be nicely designed. It has to be iconic. But first is how you deliver a space that is capable to to accept most of the users. So this is the perspective for Pershing Square. This is Shanghai. It's different. It's the river walk, 13 miles river walk, and it's about connecting because there's some parts of the promenade was you had some parts of promenade, existing parts, but it was not connected. So, and there's also a lot of activities still functioning on the banks. So the idea was to have three speeds, one dedicated to bikers, sports, using rollers, and whatever. I know a main pass and a pass which is more slow, very slow, when you can walk very slowly and benefit from the place. So I won't show you much picture, but sometime you have existing facilities. So we have lifted the promenade. So being above is sometimes very interesting because you get rid of the ground condition, and this is sometimes very interesting. So we're not only working a huge project, we have some projects which are much more small, like the Wuhan Garden. It's for a garden festival, 100% bamboo, including the wall. And Florix in Geneva is a steel garden, cotton steel garden. I won't have the time to explain, but there's an underground car park here, so we couldn't plant big trees on the. And now, and I will end this very long talk. We are one of the 4 teams in charge, competing for reinventing le Trocadéro, la Tour Eiffel, Champ de Mars, Campus Martius, no, the French one, which is about 60 hectares, so it's bigger than here, and it's about keep it all, change it all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Olivier. So one thing that's very important to say is that civic engagement is a critical part of this. All of the members of our team have been working in civic engagement in a lot of our projects independently for, by my count, more than 60 years collectively in putting this together. And yes, 60 years, yes. And so this is from the Root of Two, from Cezanne and John's work, the Wither Veins project, which was part of the triennial and is now a permanent installation in Miami, which speaks to basically fear based on the internet and basically social divisiveness. This is, of course, the project that Anya talked about a few moments ago. Some of the people from this project are here today and has marshaled actually $1.2 million in collective funding from local foundations in support of this project. And this is work that I have been engaged in with my partner in crime in the back, Eric DeWicki. These are capstones and studios, and also a project that was completed for the city a few years ago about the Herman Kiefer complex. I also study, I should mention, I've spent 25 years studying university relationships, institutional relationships with distressed communities, particularly in Philadelphia and Atlanta. And this is an example from Agence Terre, has been doing work in Rennes and Nantes, kind of cities in France. But one thing important to mention about all of our engagement work is that we see one thing that's very important. First thing is a quantitative analysis that actually makes sure that our engagement is actually representative of the populations that we're engaging. And then the other thing is that we're thinking about design that actually pushes the imaginary, and then we're talking about programming that actually pulls different constituencies into the space through programming to make sure that they feel welcome and we can push the imaginary once they're here. But most importantly, a principle that has tied us together as a team is that engagement is not something that you engage in just for the purpose of one project. It's an ongoing, permanent relationship that goes onward for as long as you are in relation with those communities. It's something that you must constantly revisit time and time again as you move forward. And with that, I'm going to give it back to Cezanne to make some concluding remarks on our behalf.
I was just going to give you the 10-minute warning, but you're on it. You're fine.
Hello, can you hear me now? Okay. All right, so we want to really end with this idea of convergence. A lot of our approaches are really about how we take what are thought of conventionally as barriers to participation kind of within our civic commons, within our civic corridor, which is also our cultural corridor, and really reframe them around this idea that it is a place that we can and are bringing people always. And it is also a place that people are always returning back home to, inspired and changed and enlightened just that little bit more, and excited just that little bit more to continue to do the work of really being resident and present in this city. And so this convergence theme really runs throughout all of our work, and we just really want to thank you guys again for the time to present on that. And with that, we're ready to open it up for questions.
Okay, is this on? We're gonna start with the jury. I know Salvador likes to start with an introduction of all the jury members, and we'll go from there.
Just think it would be helpful for you that the jury introduces themselves, and I start with myself. I'm Salvador Salort, and I am the director of the DIA.
Hi, I'm Rick Rogers. I'm president of the College for Creative Studies.
I'm Juanita Moore. I'm president of the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History.
I think this works. I'm Julie Barkman. I'm principal and founder of Dirt Studio and professor of landscape architecture at UVA.
Hi, Maurice Cox. I'm the planning director for the city of Detroit. This is Doc.
Hello, Kara McCarty, director of curatorial, Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum.
Mario Moore, a visual artist from Detroit, but I live in Brooklyn.
William Gilchrist, Director of Planning and Building for the City of Oakland, California.
And I'm Jonathan Massey, Dean of the A. Alfred Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Michigan.
Okay, we'll open it to jury questions. Who's gonna start? Kara.
I'm happy to start.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your inspiring presentation, and I really appreciated your starting off by talking about the different cultural institutions that make up this site. I'm wondering that in your rest of the presentation, you really didn't talk so much about the actual institutions and how you might engage with the institutions. And so could you talk a little bit about how in your processes of engaging the public, the institutions, the relevance, how do you play up the relevance of the institutions in your project?
So I think in many ways, because of these institutions and their histories and how complex they are, they're not monolithic. That it really requires a stakeholder analysis of the institutions themselves. And so it's wonderful to talk to the presidents and directors of the institutions, but it's probably also important to talk to staff and employees and to talk to how they experience the space themselves. And so one thing that has been in our preparation for this presentation, we threw the word quotidian around a lot, which we didn't actually say today, about what are the everyday uses of the space. And so what are the everyday uses? What are the uses for someone who's here once a month, here once every 3 months, here's once every 3 years. And so really I think some of this is about the people who are embedded within the institutions and starting there, all of the institutions, and then moving outwards towards the neighborhoods and then towards regional users, Midwest, national, global.
So I'd like to perhaps dovetail on that a bit. And you kept referring to iconicity of these spaces. Around all the cultural institutions you have, which are myriad programs and different focuses and different physical character manifestation, what would you say are good examples of urban spaces you have worked on that have been nuanced both by the stylistic variance of what's around them, what they're connecting, and still providing that sort of destinational icon that you might arrive for the space's own sake, as well as to be the transition into the various institutions, as well as be informed around their own character by the institutions that they're bordering? Could you give examples of some urban spaces that sort of meet those marks?
sur le partout.
Bon, allez-y, je peux prendre moi aussi si vous voulez, mais non, non, non. Il vaut mieux peut-être que vous le fassiez, ouais. Alain.
Well, that's the reason why I show, even though it's a competition, we are shortlisted. I show the last slide was about La Tour Eiffel, no? La Tour Eiffel, Trocadéro, École Militaire, which is probably the most intense in terms of tourism places. There's something like 20 million visitors, no? So it's incredible. So, and the problem is the reverse, no? Because they're all concentrated in the small space, and we have to find a way to disperse them in the wider space. So, and then it's iconic, and the fact it is iconic because there's La Tour Eiffel. So yeah. So we used to work in this kind of thing. So concerning the iconicity, we can understand in different way iconicity. It can be iconic through huge events. This is one, which is the case today. It is iconic through different institutions. So what's missing is the iconicity of the place as a whole. That's what's missing. So I won't give a response today because when we told that we were exploring, we would like to explore the possibility of the place, including the roofs, including the ground and the ground, because we don't have a precise answer of what could be the iconicity. But if you think that iconicity is to add a new gesture that will be bigger than those existing, the answer is no. It's not to add a new gesture. So it doesn't mean that we'll probably will need a space very comfortable during winter. Climate is a big issue here, what I understood. But so everything is in place. It's more the way you use it, how you use it, what's in place, how you use it as a leverage. You say that as a leverage to invent this iconicity. But so that's why it's very abstract. But
I would also go back to the first question about understanding the institutions, their programs, overlaps, and opportunities. And we would be very interested in studying the existing programs, but also the aspirations. You know, institutions are living entities and they're transforming at all times. So there's the precedent of what's happened programmatically, but also the projection of what could happen, and then thinking about them as networks of people and where the productive overlap could create something greater than the sum of the parts. So we're very curious about the way we could inform the design project through existing uses and projected uses, and then imagining expanding the publics and expanding the possibility of further use. And in that expansion, we also see an opportunity for creating that kind of iconicity. There's nothing more impactful than the public occupation of space, especially by a Detroit public. And it's quite extraordinary. And the possibility of bringing ephemeral iconicity, creating spaces that allow for occupation, allow for temporary intervention, allow for a kind of playfulness in the urban realm through cultural production, we believe also is a very powerful way of adapting to contemporary modes of iconicity.
Again, really thoughtful analysis of some of the challenges, opportunities. I thought the idea of convergence versus dispersal, and I would argue Detroit is a lot about dispersal, which is kind of why we don't see a lot of people in this hub that you're describing. So I am kind of curious, what do you see as the opportunity to transform here? And I'm really trying to get kind of specific. I mean, to show all the cultural institutions dispersed across Detroit, and then to talk about them seeing the DIA as a cultural hub, I mean, that's a really wonderful aspiration. I don't know what it looks like, and I'm not quite sure how design is going to signal these things, but you must have some thoughts about how design can do that. So if you could share some of your thinking about that.
To start, and then we'll pass. Okay. So one of the things that really came up as we began to really think about the site and more importantly, the connection to the larger creative community was to really try and understand places that actually facilitate that kind of emergent condition. And so what we saw and were inspired by were the already existing events that take place in and through the district in the form of festivals and formats, and really trying to think through where are those connections that are already bringing people into the place in this kind of diffuse way, whether it's programming that exists primarily at one institution and then spreads out into the Plaza, or also thinking about the way that people have begun to disrupt and interrupt the space through other things. So that was a good starting point for us.
Are you suggesting it's programmatic or is it spatial? Because I'd like some specifics
Yes,
on what...
it is both. So I was answering
So
the
give us
first
a
part of that
give
in
us a
terms
spatial
of
one.
programmatic, and then I will hand it off to sort of talk about the way that space really creates those affordances for that programmatic activity.
It's both. Well, you can see they're more on the programmatic side and more. It's both. Well, the La Villette example is very good because it's both. It's the quality of the space and also the programmatic, the intensity of the programs. So ephemeral programs. So it's both. So we can maybe give some elements that's, for example, about infusion diffusion. You know? So it's about about program, but not only. So Anya showed a museum designed by Patrick Bouchin, who's not so famous, but a bit famous in France. A mobile museum. So it can be an incredible mobile museum. We have another place in France, a mobile museum, which is, it's a truck. But when the truck stops, then it, as you said, pop-ups. Yeah? And it's incredible. An incredible machinery, an incredible thing. It's very well designed by a designer, Nathalie Crasset, very fashionable, it's a designer. So it can be this, which is small, but it's very visible because it moves. You know? So it's very visible. And it could be changed. Yeah? In 5 years' time, it could be, it's not that expensive. So it's a living, it's something which is living, you know, it can change. And then considering the place. We would be embarrassed to give you an precise answer, but just one example. You, dangerous for us, but just think that Woodward Boulevard is shut down and you keep the tram and you replace the concrete by green, a green carpet that links the library and the DIA. And this is, it's a lot and not much, but it's very visible because Woodward Avenue is historically, as well understood, one of the main historical avenue of Detroit, and it's well known. And when you go downtown, it arrives directly to downtown. So it's in the axis of downtown. You can see downtown. You have downtown has a focus. So suddenly, it's spectacular because it's well known, it's different. It's disruptive. So it's what I'm trying to explain with Barcelona. We stopped we broke the interchange. Well, they broke the interchange. We didn't. The municipal did it, and decided to make something different. No, so it was disruptive. So you have to be disruptive. We don't know how. We don't want to give a response now because it's too, you know, it's a bit tricky. But it's being disruptive and a place that is shared, a common ground. Yeah, we don't know how yet. But today, the outdoors of the museum, which are nice, you know, nice lawn, nice trees, but finally, it's like a decor for each institution. Each institution has its car park, its own decor, green, which are one by one nice, but it doesn't make a wall. No? And so it's not surprising. So suddenly, if you think about public space, which is 32, well, how many? 75 acres. Is that right? Yeah, 75 acres in Midtown, which doesn't exist anywhere. You know? So, and you can think about it as a whole. This is iconic. So I don't want to talk about design, you know, because.
May I offer just an additional an amendment to that? So one thing is that if you think about, we need to operationalize iconicity here. And so those of you who've been to Philadelphia know that Philadelphia has a very famous art museum. Most people don't know what's inside. That really the thing that most people want to do when they go to Philadelphia is run up the stairs, like Rocky. So it's become an icon almost more important than the collection itself. And so can you create, through design, create an icon that will actually draw people into the area and make them want to run up the stairs, as it were, or come into the space, and not just of one institution, but all of them. And so I would mention that the 1965 plan actually called for housing around on the east end of the site that never got built. Some of that was controversial because it was displacing 2,900 families. But there is something to be said for, can this actually become a living community that isn't just institutions that are open between 9 and 5 o'clock, but a living space where people actually will live 24 hours a day. And so I think that it's probably a bit of both, about creating a culture of a community around the institutions, but also around that iconicity, which is how can we create, through design, an environment where people of all ages, all races, economic groups will want to come and figuratively run up the stairs.
What about if you're thinking along that line? If you know the design that sort of goes right into the museum and opens up those doors so people can, like, you don't stop there, as opposed to that you're there, but then you also, it opens up our doors because we all have these. Someone else mentioned the different entrances and different ways of getting into the museum. So, all of us have walls that are sort of very closed, and, the Charles Wright Museum is really an enclosed space. It's hard to know what's in it as you drive by. The same with this building and so forth and so on, the library. So how do you think about the outside design that also sort of follows into the buildings?
So I'm not the designer here, so I'm going to pass it to them. But I will say that we did start to think about, in our preparations, about the edge condition, and also thinking about the gateways. And so how do we think about both the edge? And we stopped ourselves from going too far, just in the interest of preparing for the presentation, to not get too specific. And I think that we're seeing this as an investigation of how that could be solved. We're not sure because one of the slides we showed the different entrances, because we did start to explore what it meant for there to be these different entrances on different sides. And so the Charles Wright, of course, is a particular, it's facing Warren and kind of away from the Science Center. And so I think there's something to be said for how do we kind of create a connection so that you can think about what the itinerary would be from, that's why the cross was there. What would be the connection between the Detroit Historical Museum, the DIA, and the Charles Wright in that path? And what would be the path from the College of Creative Arts in the other direction? But that would require both looking at the cross and also the edge condition.
Could you speak some more about the community engagement aspect of the project? I mean, you did talk about learning about the institutions, how they overlap, work together, but with the idea that of the common ground, or this being a commons, you were really talking about the interests of the entire city, and it's a big spread out place, and it's great diversity in the city, a lot of different interests. So how do you sort of tap into all of that, get the feedback, and then from that sort of very wide outreach, distill it back down into a plan that has some legitimacy in the eyes of the people who participated in the process?
So one of the things I'll say is across kind of all of the firms that are presented in our team is a kind of commitment to really understanding both qualitative and quantitative research. And in terms of qualitative, that really looks at everything from participant observation and kind of urban ethnography to really thinking about the ways that storytelling, particularly in Detroit, can be very powerful ways of bringing kind of the voice of the audience and the residents into exactly shaping kind of meaning and difference in place. So I would say, just to sort of start there, we all kind of come from that similar frame of expertise. But then the other thing that becomes really important is the way that we actually think about how we test and iterate. And so with that, I'm gonna sort of hand it over to Anya.
From our perspective, it's very difficult to tap into everyone's opinion and engage everyone. But what we're aware of is that there's an incredibly powerful network of people who are cultural leaders and actors who already make up a system, an ecosystem that we're aware of, that we work with professionally as researchers, as artists, as architects and administrators. And by tapping into that resource, we think that we can build a stronger network that plugs into the aspirations of future programming on site. So from our perspective, it would be localizing all of those cultural efforts, understanding the vast human activity that's happening, and inviting the leaders of those micro utopian cultural projects to the table as instigators for future possibilities, rather than throwing our nets too wide, understanding that there's power in the network already. That would be one thing. I think another question that seems to be circulating is, is there a hotness factor? You know, like when you look at a proposition that's about having a civic commons, creating a common ground, and talking about iconicity through occupation, where does the hotness factor, the imageability, the international attractor come from? In a kind of post-Bilbao moment in urban design and urban reflection. And I think what we're saying is that there are many possibilities, from operating on the architecture, imagining opening up certain aspects of the existing architecture, to stitching together the underbelly of infrastructure, such as the parking, to reintroducing commercial intrigue and the possibility of that kind of programming that seems sometimes antithetical to institutional ideals, but can sometimes be incredible for instigating activity in the urban landscape. And then using the city, imagining the city itself as an actor and as the icon or the thing to be looked at and engaged, with the possibility of thinking about all of the multiple datums that we'd like to engage. So those are some of the thinking that's been percolating among us as we continue to imagine how we would work on the project.
I want to, I know there's two hot questions. Bill and Mario, can you wait for a few questions from the audience? We'll open it up to, if you want to step up to the mic, we'll take some questions.
Good afternoon, everybody. One of the things that we're dealing with at the DIA is accessibility, primarily because given our regional transportation situation, a lot of our visitors are pretty much forced, if I can use that term, to drive here, which kind of conflicts with walkability, because walkability really encourages people to walk versus driving to their destination. My question is, in your experience, given the situation that we're facing right now, and we will be facing in the years to come, is how do you come up with a design that kind of balances those two needs?
Unfortunately, I don't have a great answer to that. This is a regional problem. This is not just a Detroit problem, this is a regional problem. And how users in Washtenaw County and Oakland and Macomb get here Even from the airport, it's a challenge just to get here. If you have a long layover you want to visit this part of town, it's difficult. And my friends who work in the airline industry say, I'm not paying $80 a cab to get there. It's just not worth it. So there's something to be said for actually using the network that Anya just talked about to actually press for better regional transit that can actually solve that. I'm not sure that any solution that we could propose locally within the Arts District could actually solve the regional problem. We can only press on institutions like the one that Anya and we work for, the University of Michigan, which has done a lot to try to increase accessibility, but it's not going to get solved until we can think about a regional solution that brings all different constituencies, not just Oakland, Macomb, and Washtenaw in, but also downriver and some other parts of the region, and makes it very easy to get here, which I agree with you, it's very difficult.
As a practitioner of interim solutions, we've also been discussing how short-term solutions might instigate greater use. So whether that's a kind of mobile system that brings in certain members from certain communities through the network into contact with the museum. And this is part of this kind of infusion-diffusion process that we've been talking about. We think of those as short-term solutions to get the conversation going about need and illustrate interest. And hopefully those kinds of statistics and that kind of engagement contributes to an idea about better infrastructure for mobility.
Have another question?
Yes, hello, my name is Victoria Bell, founder of the Concrete Oasis Project. I'm actually from around this neighborhood. I used to live in the Nicholas Hood Medical Courts across the street from Receiving Hospital. When I was growing up, the Detroit Festival of the Arts was probably the greatest free festival for everyone to be engaged in. Everyone knew about it and felt invited to access all that the Cultural Center brought to the area. People from all over the Midwest came as well. Having been on the board for the art department of Wayne State University, they still get calls about when is the festival coming back. There was a UK researcher out of museum studies that found that most people of color, people of moderate to low income, do not feel invited in cultural institutions. So my question is, how will you invite and further engage the people that are actually here in the city of Detroit and have access to Woodward 53? That's a bus that, you know, can get here on a regular basis. When Graham Beale had the official grand opening, re-grand opening of the DIA after several $1 million in renovation, the line was wrapped around, but the hours were extended. So you had morning hours, and then you had hours after 5 where people, the working class, could come in and see the sites that the museum had to offer. So until you have maybe one or two times a month where people can come in, and not just Fridays, like maybe Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and a Wednesday, where the museum is open or where the museums are open until maybe 10 or 11 a.m., maybe looking at the unions to volunteer some time to come in and, you know, engage the people. I don't think you're going to get much more than what you've already gotten at this point, no matter what you build. So that would be my question. What are you going to do?
That's such a fantastic question. And in our research with our team in the past, we've looked at ways that community engagement has worked in unlikely places. And we've looked at the relationship between how much is invested in an institution versus its programming and what those outcomes are. We looked at maybe 60 projects of about this scale and recognized that institutions that spent more on their infrastructure, architecture, and design than on their programming tended to fail in their community engagement processes. It's just the reality. So designers can't, budget for everything that is possible in the future for institutions, and more, in a more complicated sense, a network of institutions. But we can't point to research about how much investment is really necessary into culturally salient programming that is the source of the invitation. We've also looked at the role of childhood education in inviting families in. So because our children in the city are an amazing resource, they're also a formidable energy, and they're always a way into an invitation through more resourceful and pointed programming that gets everyone through the door. I would also say that we, in our study of institutions and how to make places inviting, informalism plays an incredibly important role. So how do we create spaces that deconstruct what we anticipate from institutions to create environments where bad things can happen if you act badly, or funny things can happen, or dance can happen, or programs can happen in close proximity to each other that normally don't happen in institutions. But that requires a very specific kind of vibe that's designed, curated, and thought of so that everyone feels included. So we're very interested in some of those methods and systems, and are happy to apply that research if we're given the opportunity to continue the research process here.
I think we'll go back to Mario and Bill. And
so I wanted to know, like, collectively as the team, as the separate firms, like, what have you worked on together, or capacities together? And also through those projects, or whatever that may be, what was the community engagement specifically for those specific projects?
So I will say, as is common for a lot of people here, I wear multiple hats. So in my role as Director of Creative Industries for Creative Mini Michigan, I work and support and empower individual artists and creative practitioners and designers all throughout the city. So to date, I think we've, done thousands of events that have supported in different ways. So that includes everything from grant making. So at one point, Akoaki was one of our grantees for that work around Resident Detroit, which is a place-based social justice work. But then equally, we've had the opportunity and privilege to really curate a series of interventions as part of the Saint Etienne Design Biennale last year in 2017 that was done through Design Corps. And with that, I curated and hosted a platform called Space. That was a Root of Two and Creative Many design space that really offered opportunities for conversation and discussion and exchange between the different installations. And so we were able, through kind of that partnership, to bring over 60 Detroiters to France with us. So we're really about how we facilitate intentional exchanges across that and really create platforms for engagement. In terms of the kind of technology work that I do, I'll just take one little second to talk about the kind of way that we use engagement in that, is to really make the technology accessible and fun and playful. So we will run civic hackathons and make-a-thons in order to do things by, for, and with the community, never at them. So that's kind of some of the things that we do, but we fundamentally, I think that the community is already engaged, and we need to find them.
I'm sorry, I've got to interrupt you.
Sure.
Just to restate the
Yes.
question.
Yes.
How have you worked together,
Sure.
including Transolar,
Yes.
who's not here?
Yes.
And if there's a project where maybe one or more of you work together on that specific project, how did you conduct the community engagement?
Sure.
Okay. Thank you for the clarification. So we've never worked together as a team that you see here now, but we've all individually worked together on separate projects where we've been able to identify what we're good at and what we'd like to, what kind of affinities and aspirations we share. So as Cezanne mentioned, we were both curators for the Saint Etienne Biennale. We did 2 different exhibitions. We leveraged that opportunity to work with Detroiters, and this was a community engagement type of ideal that we have, that rather than asking for opinions about what they'd like to see at the Biennale, they came with us and expressed themselves. That's kind of that's where our attitude falls into the project. I had the opportunity to work with Olivier in Mexico City this year. This is where we met. We were working through the French government on the Mexico City airport project, looking, and the neighborhoods surrounding the Mexico City airport project, and we wrote a proposal to the Mexican government about how those acres and acres of land might be mitigated and rendered civic. We worked with Etienne at the University of Michigan. Akoaki worked with TransSolar 10 years ago on a competition. We came in second. We were very close, but we enjoyed working with them very much. So we've had opportunities to test our sensibilities, and this produces sort of the penultimate opportunity for us to bring our sensibilities together and try something new.
Part of the question is, but you're far, how will you manage that? It's a fact that we work everywhere. We won this project in Los Angeles. We opened an office in Los Angeles. We won this competition in Barcelona. We opened an office in Barcelona. It's a joint venture in Barcelona. We have an office in Shanghai. So we have a lot of work in China, but we won't open many offices in China. But so it's not about being bigger, it's just about being closer. No? So if we have, par chance, by chance, we're still on board, and if we win this project, we'll consider the fact that either make a joint venture and send somebody from Paris, but we'll be here, because it doesn't work, especially here, because it's a lot about social engagement. It's not just about, in China you just design things and 6 months after it's done, and it's a decision coming from the top. So it's different, and we can be critical about this. So it's totally different here. So it's much more close than what we're doing in France. With the issue of social engagement, it's very important. So we have to be here. If we have the chance to win, we'll be here.
So, thank you. My question is much more around technique. As designers, I noticed in your analysis you had sort of a transector section cut across the city, and you identified 3 different data, underground, city ground, and city skyline in a diagram. And for an open plaza like this, and you're familiar enough with the size, scale, and character of this place, when you look at your design investigation, does that sort of sectional analysis play in the range of things you'll explore? So in other words, when you think about the Z coordinate, now we're talking about a plaza, we're talking about iconicity, we're talking about a destination focus. We're looking at a landscape that really doesn't have a high public point to look out. We're pretty flat getting towards this river. I mean, are these the kind of things that you bring that type of analysis to bear? Because I really didn't see much spring out from your presentation after you did that cut. And that was a very interesting perspective to look at. And I'm just wondering, how does that inform the work that you do in an open space of this nature?
Ici, il faut que je traduise, je le ferai, monsieur, si vous voulez.
Ouais. OK, non, pas encore, vous comprenez, oui. Ouais. Allez-y, ouais.
It's the next step, no? I mean.
But I'm asking, yeah, go ahead.
What we don't know is.
They answered it to some degree by saying we'll use the roofs, and in Barcelona they made a hill, right? Yeah. So I think there's some answers that were latent in the presentation already for possibilities.
Should he be up there with you? No, but I'm asking really within the containment of the open space itself, is that something you would explore? You can just say we.
Yeah.
He would like to say we.
Okay.
That this is an ingredient.
It is.
And of course, there's the question of what is the marker that can bind the institutions.
Yeah, that's together. Right, because the rooftops might not necessarily do that.
Right.
And I'm really just trying to understand what your elasticity is around that kind of analysis and how you respond.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Okay.
And the
It's just about being able.
So I'm going to take
escape from the ground conditions.
Without necessarily having to go into the buildings to do so. Yeah.
Right. Okay. I'll take a little bit of blame for this. So I'm the odd duck in a way as an urban planner with this design term. So I'm a planner with design sensibilities but no design training. And so in preparing this, this is what are the possibilities here? And so one of them sure is that given the dimensions of the space, given the infrastructure, can we go up, can we go down, can we go sideways, like where do we go? And so I think based on our collective knowledge of the space, some of this is informing this, that we're posing these as investigations, that these are things that we'll have to explore, and that when we have more data to understand the full, we don't know how deep that parking lot goes. We'd love to know.
But it's not off the table is the point.
No,
Okay.
absolutely
All
right. No. Thanks.
Okay, I think we should let you guys do your wrap, 10 minutes or whatever you need. Do you have a wrap?
All right.
You did the wrap. Okay.